All right. In theory, we're getting going. Did we start the event here in Discord by chance?
Of course we did, Brooks.
Of course we did. We did not. We are now.
Yeah, see,
All
it's
right.
just live. I don't know what you're talking about, buddy. That red dot's been on this whole time.
Yeah, exactly. It just does what it does. No problems at all.
That's right. That's right.
All right.
It's got an agenda like us.
Well, what can I say? So I'll kick us off because I kind of want to get into this because this is some really fun stuff. Again, once we're in 3.9, we're able to sort of talk about, everyday things and us, because before this, we really, really couldn't. But it's kind of fun to be able to go into these things a little bit more contemporaneous stuff, even though it's, by more contemporaneous, I mean less than 100 years old, basically at this point. But thank you for joining the Quarantine Collective's ongoing reading of Anti-Oedipus. Super excited to have all of you here. I'm trying out new audio equipment. If you get artifacts or any shittiness, just pop in there and be like, Brooks, terrible. Stop that, and I'll do what I can to fix it. So just Brooks. So if audio's fucked up anywhere, just let me know. I'm still fine-tuning. But we are in 3.9 of Anti-Oedipus, the Civilized Capitalist Machine. And we've been going over kind of a recapitulation of not just most of the book, but I would say at this point, Marx, actually, and really a recapitulation of parts of what is the massive tome that is Capital. We've just finished talking about the secondary part that's sort of made alongside production. It's not just, this pure system of production, but anti-production. What anti-production is, what conditions production, how these things come to be, how these things work, and how they interplay. Specifically, within capitalism, the state, police, army, military output specifically, they spoke of in the last paragraph, and they talk about this effusion from the apparatus of anti-production, characteristic of the entire system. The effusion is that of anti-production within production at all levels of the process. Again, when we talk about the levels of the process, when we talk about capitalism, it is not one monolithic single thing. It isn't a block of rock that just simply is homogeneous. There are processes, there are productions, there's historically and socially determined elements. There is everything that desire interplays with and plays into, and everything that is produced by desire. It is more complicated than simply desire, but it is a lot of stuff that is constantly producing and making shit and doing things. So as we talk about sort of making this move and discussing sort of what happens to workers, what happens to the bullshit that is produced alongside normal production, we're about to get into sort of the larger bit that sort of really, I think, really puts a fine point on how anti-production works with us and within us, or within the labor that we produce. And that's going to be fun to get into. I'm jazzed for it. And I think that's about it. Jack, you got anything to add today for me? Anything at all? Nothing? You got nothing?
I guess not.
Oh, really? You sure?
Yeah.
Okay, that works for me, I guess. I mean, I'm not going to complain terribly much, I suppose. Yeah. I think I'm a little quiet. Alright. Let's see, I'm just going to real quick fix the thing. Sorry, everyone. I just have more complex shit going on than I really want at any point. And that is fucking quiet. Let's boost that up. Let's get it back up to a good normal. There we go. That's much better. Okay. We'll dive in. So we are currently on page 236, right in the dead middle of the page. We're on the left here. Here, and I'll share my screen. I should be doing that so that you know what the fuck I'm even talking about. And we'll dive in.
Hold on a second, buddy.
Oh, please.
Your audio is crackly.
Excellent.
Yeah, you're
Thank
popping.
you. Did that fix it?
Yeah, I think so.
Yes.
Yeah. All right, good. I'm getting used to the new audio setup. For those of you who were around when I did this last time, and I know Jack was, I think JK as well, it takes me a little bit to get things dialed in. We'll just say. We'll just say that.
Okay, now it's I can hear a bit of crackling.
Ah, fuck, it's doing it again.
When you speak for longer, like it's almost regular.
Okay. Oh, okay. Let me see what I can do here. That might actually suffice and fix it up a little bit. Does that do a decent job of that?
I think so.
All right.
Estelle, can
we'll
you hear
find out.
anything, Ben?
It's all right.
It's all right. It's acceptable.
Adequate is good enough.
I'll take acceptable. Hey, I'll figure out more later. It's the way it works. To read though. Here, Andre Gort's double portrait of the scientific and technical worker takes on its full meaning. Although he has mastered a flux of knowledge, information, and training, he is so absorbed in capital that the reflux of organized, axiomatized bullshit, I'm going to say bullshit coincides with him, so that when he goes home in the evening, he rediscovers his little desiring machines by tinkering with a television set. Oh, despair. Of course, the scientist has no revolutionary potential. He is the first integrated agent of integration, a refuge for bad conscience, and the forced destroyer of his own creativity. Let us consider the more striking example of a career à la American career. American career. I'm not going to fucking ruin that by trying to pronounce it. With abrupt mutations, just as we imagine such a career to be. Gregory Bateson begins by fleeing the civilized world, by becoming an ethnologist, following the primitive codes and savage flux. Then he turns in the direction of flux that are more and more decoded, those of schizophrenia, from which he extracts an interesting psychoanalytic theory. Then, still in search of a beyond, of another wall to break through, he turns to dolphins, to the language of dolphins, to flux that are even stranger and more deterritorialized. But where does the dolphin flux end, if not with the basic research projects of the American Army, which brings us back to preparations for war and the absorption of surplus value? It's crackling again. Are you fucking kidding me? What is my luck? My luck is bad today.
Oh, and it sounds kind of like you're speaking from a tin can.
Excellent. That is just deeply frustrating.
Sometimes my mic like picks up, gets like all crackly, but like with the noise suppression, it tries to suppress it also. It ends up sounding very quiet.
It ends up sounding worse. Yeah, I mean that can happen. It's one of the tough parts about trying to figure this out. I've got fans running because it's a little bit of a hot day here in the Portland, and really, there's nothing quite as miserable as being in hot, humid weather. For me, at least. I know some people fucking love it. Is that slightly better at all?
Yeah, I'd say it's better. It's
All right.
acceptable.
I think it's great.
All right, I'll go with JK saying it's great. So let's talk a little bit about a couple of these things. Just to kind of go back through, they mentioned two particular characters here. Andre Gortz is really a fascinating writer. Very, very specifically, he wrote about the scientific and technical worker, as they talk about here, this idea of the knowledge economy. He noticed that scientific and technical workers were becoming more and more the forefront of the operant of the proletariat, that manual labor, what we would see as like factory labor, is kind of moving out of being the primary force of production, and instead the knowledge economy, I believe he called it, and also he came up with the term cognitive capitalism, which I think anyone who's spent a decent amount of time online or has worked with any of the social media platforms can be very quickly aware of what cognitive capitalism is. That ultimately capitalism is becoming about the exploitation of primarily knowledge rather than industrialized sort of labor, the stuff Marx talked about. It's a transfer of the type of work that he did. The way that they talk about it here, and it's really a fantastic sort of double play they're making with him. His work, as he sort of dove deeper into it, how do I put this? I'm trying to find, there's a specific anecdote. I couldn't quite find it beforehand, and I'm trying to figure out how to put it into words. Because it's that footnote, but the footnote is really tough to find. Give me 2 seconds. Let me see if I can pop it out here. Yeah, it's just Gort's work. It's not the anecdote. It's fine. 2 seconds, sorry. Get back to the right page. God damn it. Why am I not able to find the page I'm on? Jesus Christ. Having a really tough day. Sorry, guys. I was up all night with the kids. It is no fun. Come on, Gortz. Come on, where are you? There you are. Okay. Just to reread it. Although he has mastered a flux of knowledge, information, and training, he's so absorbed in capital, the reflux of organized, axiomatized bullshit coincides with them, so that when he goes home, he rediscovers his little desiring machines by tinkering with the television set. Oh, despair. Gortz wrote about the way that he found himself and people in this sort of semi-scientific community, or tinkerers as we might call them now, spend their days working, doing capital work in the knowledge field in cognitive capitalism, and then the only time they're able to sort of freely work on their stuff is going home and repairing, tinkering, working with stuff. The television set as the example here, but you see this a lot inside of these communities, inside of people who are in the DIY community, things like that. The setup sort of talking about the way labor has changed. The scientist as such has no revolutionary potential. He is integrated agent of integration. He's a refuge for bad conscience, the forced destroyer of his own creativity. The way that the scientific mind works, as they've sort of talked about it, and they sort of talked about how science becomes sort of recapitulated by capital just a few paragraphs ago. Again, they let them work freely in their corner. They do whatever they want, and then they bring them back in. But it's the scientist who kind of does that work by being the thing they're talking about. They use Bateson as an example here in this paragraph. By fleeing the civilized world, becoming an ethnologist, following primitive codes and savage flux, he then turns and he continues to do work that you could say is more and more and more radical, until he starts making a move that they're being, we'll just say, slightly critical of here. But as he sort of makes his work into cybernetics, as he makes his work push into sort of the natural mind, as he makes his way into dolphins ultimately, and then working with the military on trained dolphins that can bomb things and have bombs strapped to them, and ultimately bringing himself all the way back again, because they're allowed to be schizophrenic on the periphery. They're allowed these sort of tinkerings in their free time. but now is the time for serious work. Can we get back to it? And this is that last line. Where does the dolphin flex end if not with the basic research projects of the American Army, bringing us back to the preparation for war and the absorption of surplus value? Bateson is a really fascinating writer to sort of dive into. A lot of people, I think, probably have come across a handful of things he has written. They've even referenced a handful of things already in here, but it's a really great sort of example of coming back around, that ultimately capital comes back. Does that make sense? It's a light, simple set of examples here that they're giving, talking about the way that these things sort of operate.
Yeah, I think it does.
So the point is that Bateson never escapes capitalism, or he thought he could escape it, but he's ultimately is reabsorbed into the capitalist system again, right, towards the end.
Well, the system, basically, the way that, again, scientists are freely allowed to use the tools they want and go tinker as they want, but at some point the work becomes more serious, and the Army will take the idea and go, oh, you can make dolphins communicate? Let's see if we can, and use them for war, as an example. The way that the system as a whole operates is like this, and they're trying to get us to sort of step away from thinking of these as, oh, Gortz wanted X, Y, and Z, or Bateson wanted X, Y, and Z, thinking of them as sort of these individualized autonomous actors who were freely sort of working in the society, and instead looking at what they were doing, how it was being used, and over time, as their purpose sort of shifted, how it operated, if that makes sense. And so when we start talking again about the way that the state operates, the state, its police, and its army, a gigantic enterprise of anti-production, this interplay, as they call it, of relations and differential coefficients of decoded flux, not only the nature of limits that capitalism reproduces, but the presence of anti-production within production itself, this thing that has now been placed into it, rather than repression being at the end of the line, or being something that sort of is visited from without. It's now within the process. And the process itself, as they use the example of Gortz and Bateson, the process itself has these bends where it's bending production back towards sort of what capital needs, or towards ultimately what anti-production is going for, this expenditure with the army, or other ways that sort of Bateson, these guys sort of fed into those systems. And that's the point, is that it's within the system itself. It's within the processes and production of the system itself. Does that make sense? Jack, you got anything for me?
No.
Because I see you talking in the chat.
Yeah, I guess I'll just reiterate what I said. So that you can read this in terms of personal versus like industry and that, but I don't think it's that kind of question, right? I don't think it's like, do my interests align with the interests of capital or whatever? I think it's expanding what they were saying in some of the previous pages about the periphery and absorption.
So is this point that it's there's a kind of futility in the efforts to escape, like Bateson did, to escape from the capitalist system, and that ultimately he's whatever he did, with nature, as to find a refuge from the capitalist system, he's ultimately reabsorbed. All his research has been co-opted. Right? So did Bateson end up working for the military, or did he?
No. His work ended up being used by the military.
Okay, so his work was okay.
So I don't know if it's like, I don't know if it's co-opting though, right? Like I don't know if it's this problem of like I'm trying to do my project and it exists outside of capital until capital reabsorbs it, right? I think it's more like what he's doing here is illustrating this problem of knowledge and stupidity vis-a-vis lack in the aggregate, right? And how the state plays with government expenditure to basically fund some of this. So that, at least for me, like it's not so much that he fails to escape, it's that there is a question posed about how to understand escape. Because Deleuze and Guattari are going to lay out what they call lines of escape, right? So the question becomes, what constitutes such an escape when you're dealing with how capital works with centralized zones, I guess, and periphery, right, to manage the falling rate of profit, to displace the limit, and to use like anti-production within production, right? If that's your circumstance or conditions for production, what then is escape, right?
Yeah, I well, like I heard almost well, like about things that people seem to think is kind of sticking it up to capital, like uh, going somewhere, making homesteading or something, and like it's not clear to me that those things are really doing anything to uh, capital or capitalism. And I think this is kind of the equivalent here.
So if I could illustrate the point, and before I do want to be fair to what's been said too. Like, even though I'm not focused on the individual here, I do want to point out, to be fair, that Deleuze and Guattari do notice that this affects people in terms of creativity, right? That it is undermined here. So I don't want to dismiss that either, because I think that is important. But it's the point about what he's doing, right? Is he's following primitive codes, right? So within capital, you still have the matter of codes, right? And what was his name? Gregory? I always think
Gregory
of
Bateson.
Kafka. Thanks, man.
Me too.
If you
It's the first thing I did when I was reading it again today. I was like, God damn it.
I can't remember Gregory's last name, but yeah, that's exactly where my mind's going. I'm picturing him waking up as a cockroach, but yeah, it's that he follows primitive codes, right? And so the lines of production he's following, right, are themselves, in this sense, part of the capitalist production, right? So in that sense, right, what's basically going to happen is following that kind of production, right, is insofar as a line of escape doesn't happen, right, he's making it possible for a reabsorption to happen of surplus value by producing upon the code, so to speak, so that they can be decoded, right? Or at least that's one of the things he's making possible.
Say that another way for me, so I can follow what your critique is and what you're saying.
Yeah. Okay. Gregory Bateson begins by fleeing the civilized world by becoming an ethnologist and following the primitive codes and savage flows. Okay, so that's the first step, right? He's working with codes. So his line of movement, if you like, is toward code. Then he turns in the direction of flows that are more and more decoded, those of schizophrenia, from which he extracts an interesting psychoanalytic theory. So in that sense, right, notice what's being put together is codes and decodification, right? Then, still in search of a beyond of another wall to break through, he turns to dolphins, the language of dolphins, to flows that are even stranger and more deterritorialized. So again, he's looking for, he's trying to find things that don't seem to be conditioned by capital, but what he's working with are coded and decoded flows, right? That's kind of the matter of it. But where does the dolphin floods end, if not with the basic research projects of the American Army, which brings us back to the preparations for war and the absorption of surplus value, right? This movement toward the periphery, right, is something they've talked about where that is part of how capital deals with the falling rate of profit and the displacement of the limit, right? So to go to the periphery is not in itself a line of escape at essence, right? And part of what they're saying here, right, is that movement still works with flows that are coded and decoded. So to the larger point, right, if we're thinking about lines of escape, what is a line of escape in this kind of conditionality, right? Under these conditions, what escapes are possible, generally speaking?
Yeah, having trouble with it. It's a tough paragraph because they're talking about the way that anti-production is happy to be produced alongside these other things, how the state is able to utilize the technical advancements. We had already the discussion about, I think it was a paragraph or two ago, that the innovations are only adopted insofar as they entail a rise in profits through a lowering of the cost of production. Marx goes through that. They talk about the sort of nature of this and how when we're talking about how these things work together, the political, military, economic complex is the more manifest in that it guarantees the extraction of human surplus value on the periphery and in the appropriated zones of the center, but also because it engenders for its own part an enormous machinic surplus value by mobilizing resources of knowledge and information capital. And finally, because it absorbs a greater part of the surplus value produced. They then go directly into the middle part of that statement where they say, they talk about the state, the police, and how it's, works at the periphery and production itself and within science and technical. They use the example of Gortz, and again, it's not the easiest sort of part to find because they're citing a French translation, and so it's not the English version of the book. We've had this problem before.
Yeah,
I'm having trouble following exactly their point here, though. I guess I would say. I don't think I'm alone in that, but yeah.
What you just laid out, that's exactly the point.
Right. That's it.
Yeah, no, that's exact. This is just a case in point of that, right? So, like, to that end, right, he goes to the periphery by way of code, right? At the periphery, he finds decoded flows, right? So this is part of this knowledge stupidity thing, right? At least I think the stupidity is decoded flows. I could be wrong there, but we can bracket it out for now, right? So he's working with both of those as part of production, right? So to move to the periphery is sometimes seen as, in essence, an escape, right? Or necessarily revolutionary, right? To go to the periphery. But that's not in itself enough for Deleuze and Guattari, right? Because that is to forget that it's constituted through capital as well, that it plays a productive role, right? And to go to where dolphins are, to the peripheries of the aquatic, apparently, right? Even that bears the same point for Deleuze and Guattari, even if it's a language of stupidity, or stupidity from the standpoint of code, we'll say, right? It's a schizophrenized code, we might say. all of that, right, is this kind of point about how that is in itself not a line of escape for Deleuze and Guattari, but a production of simply a social production itself, right?
Yeah, I can get that. It feels like they're making some very pointed commentary on Gortz directly, but it's probably not worth going into too deep. It's always been tough to find that and sort of get exactly what they're talking about. But I think with Bateson, I think it's a fair point. I think what I stated is, I think you're right. These are just particular examples of the thing they've been coming at and they've been talking through. I'm probably overthinking it, as I tend to.
Would it be correct to say that the codes that Basin, discovers, right, and in his fleeing from, civilized society and then going out to the periphery of that society and discovering these codes in nature, like the dolphins, but then even that is is able
Well,
to be decoded by the by the military, by the
Well,
capitalist.
it's not decoded. It's recoded by the military, because I think the way that they're phrasing this is basically saying, hey, look, Bateson went out, he found some codes, but he got really excited when he found these decoded flux, and he chased those, and he used terms. Bateson used terms like getting out into nature or getting into the ecosphere and ecology and blah blah, blah. And they're just like, look at how do you think the flux got decoded? Like, they become deterritorialized, they become stranger, they become odder. Like, this is what capital does. And lo and behold, capital ended up finding a way to recapitulate and recode and bring it back in. Because this, again, all is capital. The same way that they spent a lot of the book really trying to get us to do away with the idea of man versus nature, machine versus person, things like that, the little odd sort of dualities. This would be that, the idea that there's a place you can go run and hide from capital. Yeah, that really put, I think, well in their E. But it's kind of like looking at going into the wild and living there as being escaping capitalism. But like, you're not these flux are being deterritorialized, they're being decoded. This is capital. This is how capital functions. And the dolphin flux ends, if not with this research project that pulls back in. I am in street remote. There you go. Thank you.
So would the surplus value be the whatever the capitalist capitalist society is able to use, right, for its purposes, for its profit motive?
Real quick, I just want to say the decoding, overcoding. I think you're both right there.
I didn't say
right?
overcoding.
I think I'm sorry, recoding. My bad. There's so many prefixes.
I know.
Lose track.
It is particular their use in this case, though.
Yeah, it's all good. But yeah, to both your points, like I think you're both right that there's a question of recoding and decoding going on there, right? And I think that's a good call out.
Shall we move to the next paragraph?
We should take that question on surplus value, and then we can move to the next paragraph.
I feel like surplus value is going to have its own paragraph after this next one. Like, this next paragraph is like making the last little bit of a commentary on the capitalist state and the socialist state, and then it goes right into surplus value. So I almost feel like we can put a pin in it for like 20 minutes.
I think that's fair.
Because I don't want to repeat and have to then do it again, which I've been doing this reading quite a bit more than I want. So let's blast through this next paragraph because I think it's this one's a little bit more upfront with what it's saying, and I think it's this one I think I understand better. So we'll find out if I do. In comparison to the capitalist state, the socialist states are children, but children who learn something from their father concerning the axiomatizing role of the state. But the socialist states have more trouble stopping unexpected flux, leakage, except by direct violence. What on... Who am I hearing? Hearing
Modest warfare.
Modesty warfare.
Give it a mute real quick there. But the socialist states have more trouble stopping unexpected flux leakage except by direct violence. What, on the contrary, is called the co-opting power of capitalism can be explained by the fact that its axiomatic is not more flexible, but wider and more englobing. Such a system, no one escapes participation in the activity of anti-production that drives the entire productive system. Quote, but it is not only those who man and supply the military machine who are engaged in an anti-human enterprise. The same can be said in varying degrees of many millions of other workers who produce and create wants for goods and services which no one needs. And so interdependent are the various sectors and branches of the economy that nearly everyone is involved in one way or another in these anti-human activities. The farmers supplying food to troops fighting in Vietnam, the tool and die makers turning out the intricate machinery needed for a new automobile model, the manufacturers of paper and ink and TV sets whose products are used to control the minds of the people, and so on, and so on. Someone check what that footnote is. Thus, the three segments of ever-widening capitalist reproduction process are joined, three segments that also define the three aspects of its immanence. 1. The one that extracts human surplus value on the basis of the differential relation between decoded flux of labor and production, and that moves from the center to the periphery, while nevertheless maintaining vast residual zones at the center. 2. The one that extracts machinic surplus value on the basis of an axiomatic of the flux of scientific and technical code in the core areas of the center. And 3. And the one that absorbs or realizes these two forms of surplus value flux by guaranteeing the emission of both, and by constantly injecting anti-production into the producing apparatus. Schizophrenization occurs on the periphery, but it occurs at the center and at the core as well. So it's a much cleaner paragraph. Just very, very... Starting with, again, when we talk about anti-production being produced, the anti-human enterprise, and I love that paragraph, we're not talking about purely, oh, look, someone went and joined the military. Oh, look, there's people who work at Lockheed Martin. It's the entirety of the system is propped up and built in this way. The entirety of the system does this. This is the way capital works immanently within all of these pieces and parts, including kind of all of us. It's just the way it sort of works. So when we sort of start out in this paragraph, they want to make a very quick comparison. I don't think it's hard for us to make this continue today. Socialist states are children who learn something from their father concerning the axiomatizing role of the state saying what is and what isn't, the way that, as they talked about, the movement of the state as we move from despotism to capitalism, how capital and the state get along still, how the state works. Lo and behold, it just so happens, at the time it was the Soviet Union, they're making the commentary here of, and a handful of other socialist states. We can say the same of many that are around today, including China. The reality is this setup, the way that desire is utilized all the way through, ends the same, produces the same, and ultimately has the same issues. We have this unexpected flow leakage that they talk about, the flux leakage. The way that socialist states handle it, and I think more and more capitalist states, again, this was written in 68, sort of the beginning or the high point of what you might call sort of traditional liberalism and the sort of laissez-faire state that's there to support and have welfare items and everything. I think I'm in America, very different beast when we talk about, what types of states they're speaking of. But the co-opting power of capitalism is everywhere. It's imminent to us. Anti-production is in the process. It's made in the process of all of these things. The co-opting power of capitalism is explained by the fact that its axiomatic is not more flexible. It's not that capitalism is able to bend itself as it needs. No. It's because it's wider. It is englobing, all-encompassing. It handles everything. It takes into account everything as it needs. There is no one that escapes participation in the activity of anti-production that drives the entire productive system. And they have this wonderful quote from, I don't actually know if we looked this up last time. I'm not familiar with these writers. Barron and Sweezy, Monopoly Capital. Well, that's probably a pretty decent little book. It's a hell of a sentence that they have here and thing they're saying. It's not just the man who supply the military machine engaged in this. It is all the way down. It's the farmer growing food for the process. And you can find pieces, but of everywhere. It's the people who are, a wonderful book called Video Games and War. The way that even video game industry and what is being done inside of it is able to support this and is part of the same systems. These things sort of play through all of us, as much as we may not want to understand that, or as much as we may not see how we feed into it. All of it is there. Capital has everybody in it. So interdependent are various sectors and branches of the economy that nearly everyone is involved in one way or another in these anti-human activities. And they go through a handful. So when we talk about the capitalist reproduction process, we end up with the three segments as they sort of lay them out here. One, there's the segment that extracts, and this is the more traditional Marxist, the extracts human surplus value on the basis of the differential relation between the decoded flux of labor and production, X plus DX, and that moves from the center to periphery while maintaining vast residual zones at the center. This is, I will continually look for more humans to exploit. I will find a way to exploit many right here. The way that we're sort of setting up, and if we look at America, because we tend to think of America and the West as center, pick a place in China, it's not drastically different. There are vast residual zones right at the center. If you get a chance ever visiting Shanghai, New York, Los Angeles, Seattle, San Francisco, the right now enjoys sort of shitting on how awful some of these places have it, where there are areas of San Francisco right downtown in front of Twitter where it's, gang violence, drug dealers, kind of everywhere. It's dirty, unhoused people everywhere. There's an extraordinary poverty just adjacent to extraordinary wealth, and where the center of a lot of these productions are happening. This is part of the system. This is not some accident. This is keeping the residual right here, but also utilizing it as far as we can go. You have to, because again, X plus DX is the entirety of the point. The second segment is the one that extracts machinic surplus value on the basis of an axiomatic of the flux of scientific and technical code in the core areas of the center. This is the people who are building the machines that will replace the blacksmith, or I think I saw automatic chef, automatic kitchen, the entire thing. They have one in San Francisco now. You can go pay a robot to do it, and the entire thing has been made. It's that company that made that is filled with engineers and scientists, and the machinic surplus value that is now extracted, it isn't labor directly from the people who are working and making burgers. Instead, it is now the labor that's being extracted from the people who are making the machines that make the burger, almost one step removed. This is the second segment. The third is the one that absorbs or realizes these two forms of surplus value, of flux, by guaranteeing the emission of both, constantly injecting anti-production into the producing apparatus. This is probably one of the more complex terms that they're going to be talking about. Anti-production and how they're setting up. It's kind of a big deal for the rest of the book. But right here, this is these two operants, these two segments, there is from these excess produced. The emission of these things has to be going somewhere. It doesn't just get done and someone makes a nice tidy profit and off we go and the system continues. This is not how capitalism's ever worked, but it's certainly not how they're looking at it. Because again, desire, you could say, can't be destroyed by ordinary means. And so as such, where is the desire going? Where is it going once it's been turned into dead labor that is waiting for more, or that continual potentiality that's growing, has to be expelled somewhere. War is fantastic for it. War is really brilliant for it, like flatly. Art is another really great one that's been used kind of a lot lately. War's probably been used more in our lifetimes, I think, is a safe bet. But this is that thing that says this, the producing apparatus having anti-production injected into it by the state and by sort of the system at large, and the emission of the surplus value consistently. It's a big deal.
So where would the dolphins used by the? It doesn't fit into one of these. Is that also a surplus value out of what is discovered by Basin, and then it's in nature itself? Dolphins are just part of nature, but they can be used. So it's just like it's the extracting surplus value from natural resources.
Think of Bateson in that case in terms of his technical, or the second sort of the machinic surplus value that's generated. He does these studies. He learns about how the dolphins can communicate, and they communicate in these ways, and they can do these things. We can learn to communicate, and we can train them to do X, Y, and Z. Really sort of interesting on its own, seemingly, what I'm saying it in air quotes, useless work. Like it's interesting, but it's not like cool, useful. But we can make it useful. And in fact, capitalism will make everything useful. And specifically because of how the process works, the military going, well, we can find a use for that, which they've done for a lot of other things and other scientific discoveries. Think of the massive leaps we've made in sort of biology and understanding of germ theory and illnesses and disease, and then the weaponization of these things that has happened. Not just from a profit perspective, which is one, but it's straight up being used sort of in a lot of different ways in sort of that setup. And so there's this thing that shifts. Again, when we're talking about anti-production in the setup here, let's talk about, because it's worth a moment to think through anti-production in terms of like the shift from how it exists in these different periods, because again, anti-production is a complicated thing. The world of anti-production, the forces of anti-production operate inside of capitalism, kind of in the marketplace, you might say, a marketplace of ideas, a marketplace of people, the marketplace of cash. It changes how this repression sort of comes in, and it removes it from this sort of limitation that it was when it's, for example, the despotic may have anti-production, but it's really from the king. The king is the one who, or king or queen or that position, it sort of sits there and goes, you're going to do X, Y, and Z, and all of the surplus is going to me, and I'm going to have grand projects. I'm going to build the Taj Mahal. I'm going to build the Palace at Versailles. I'm going to build the fucking Gardens of Babylon. So this is because again, we have to have expenditure of these excesses somewhere, but that's done in this point. But that transcendent end result mass, as Holland calls it, the transcendent glory of the Palace of Versailles. But instead, it is sort of spent in capitalism in the political, military, industrial complex, as they call it. Just to quote Holland, for what the production and especially the realization of surplus value require, given the inherent tendency of capitalism to overproduce on a continually larger scale, is a vast system of anti-production installed at the heart of production itself to keep its wheels turning by absorbing overproduction. If you consider the mass of production and what is made, there is an extraordinary amount produced. This exceptional, but it's not obviously being distributed evenly. It's not being distributed at all. A lot of it goes into things that simply end: bombs, weapons, military equipment, expenses that are pure expenses that don't drive other profit. As much as someone may get profit from it, someone makes the bomb, they get paid for the bomb. The bombing act, it's not the same thing as, say, if I buy a restaurant from someone, they build a restaurant, I buy a restaurant, I then get to keep doing it. I find a Funko Pop I like, I buy it from someone. The Funko Pop like continues to exist and then gain or lose value, but it's not destroyed. The military shit is destroyed. It's consumed in and of itself in its action. This is an excess. This is part of the way that the excesses of society get taken up or handled by the overall system. It's one of the great challenges to sort of understand is that capitalism isn't, we're taught in this really odd way. And again, I'm speaking specifically as an American dude here, so it may be a lot of people with different takes, but as we sort of grow, we're taught that, you know, people do work, they earn things, and we buy things, and we kind of, you know, over time we save and we get to have a life. Great. So we think of capitalism as like this sort of exchangist system that sort of allows us to continue to grow, to build, to share, all of this fun stuff. But that's not really what we do. It's not. Instead, what happens is people work, their excess is, because their excess is profit. Profit is pulled out of every single person, everyone, all the way down, handled by a handful of capitalists. But that excess continues to grow. We continue to overproduce. We overproduce a fuck ton of stuff. Go behind a grocery store and find the dumpster on the day that they throw out expired shit and see the mountain of food that we throw out and then don't allow to be donated or refuse to donate it. This excess is constant, but it's not just in food at one grocery store. You're talking about systematically, it is a mass amount of excess flux, excess profit, excess human labor, excess everything that has to have an expenditure somewhere. It has to. So it's to put it how I like to put it, if we don't find a use for it, it will find a use for it. This excess will find a use. And so when we start talking about like what it means to like be going through these things and setting them up, we need to like realize capitalism has the solution built in. The solution at this point is the political, military, industrial complex. And that's what they're talking about here. This is the one that absorbs or realizes the two forms of surplus value flux by guaranteeing the emission of both and constantly injecting anti-production into the producing apparatus. So we have schizophrenization everywhere. It's on the periphery, but it occurs at the center and the core. It has to. Like, this is decoding and setting up the creation of excess, the continual pushing towards further and further the emancipation of flux, the decoding of it, the freeing of it, and then the recoding of it, because we can't have significant excess sort of allowed to go around. And this is where, to Jack's point, this is where we think the next paragraph is going to be important, because we're talking about surplus value. And this is the thing they're, again, trying to get us to make just, I wouldn't even say a change from Marx, but to expand how Marx talked about these things and to expand how Marx discussed these things. Because to Marx, it was industrial capital versus constant capital. It was proletariat versus bourgeoisie and those things. It's not wildly far from that now, but they want us to, again, think of the entirety of production from the position of desire. And then now that we have all of this sort of infrastructure that is constantly producing, utilizing desire, creating anti-production, repressing desire inside of itself, all of this, we're still having the surplus created. And so how do we rethink what that surplus is, instead of just saying, oh, it's just a ton of capital? It's like, no, it's not just a ton of capital. It's excess that's being actively utilized. Let's see. Is the activity of anti-production the disposal of the accursed share? Yeah, it's the accursed share. Yes. I mean, it is the accretion share. This is where they take it from. They're making adjustments to it, so it's not like perfectly 1-to-1, but the way that they're talking about it, how they're discussing it, it's straight up the idea and the theory of the general economy brought in, at least as I'm reading it completely. Like it's very much that. There's some adjustments. Again, Bataille didn't have kind of the same view of desire. He didn't have the sort of Kantian take on the syntheses and how desire is processed. There's more complexity here, definitely, that adds, I think, layers of color to it that are super important to understanding ourselves and others. So that'd be what I'd add. But so WEG, for example, the use is excess, if that's what you're saying here. When we talk about the grand projects, Gardens of Babylon, the pyramids at Giza, the fucking Colossus statue, think of the white faces in the Black Hills, Mount Rushmore. These don't really have use. They're not useful in the sense of they're not producing anymore. They're not in the way that they're sort of they're not going to go towards the creation of further capital. They're part of the system. They're interjecting. Sure, they're part of it from like an image perspective. But with that setup, there's kind of this grand transcendent thing that's being done. It's not just that these things, specifically, let's talk about the Palace of Versailles. It's not just the Palace of Versailles is like a really pretty building people get to visit. It is the palace at Versailles. It's a fucking grand, emotional, spiritual, social investment of a mass amount of people beyond just being sort of super gold. The Gardens of Babylon as a world wonder are not just pretty gardens to go walk around, but it exists as like this transcendent, massive project that means something to the people, like the pyramids of Giza, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. These things have a large social investment. So when we talk about the capture of desire or the use of desire, the expenditure of desire, they get to be used in these things because it's more than just resources. But capital's weird because our investment is in capital. Like capital determines our investment in things. Capital is determinant of desire in a large set of ways. And it is, as excess grows, we will see capital grow, we see more amounts of production, blah, blah, blah. But when it builds a building, like we'll end up finding a use for it. Palace of Versailles, by the way, isn't like some holy site anymore. There isn't really any holy sites left. They're tourist sites for various businesses that are sort of built around them. It's, if you haven't been to the pyramids at Giza, horrifying tourist nightmare. Genuinely, like, it's awful. It's fucking awful. There's a great set of 2 photos. If you ever get a chance, go look for pyramids at Giza. You'll see these gorgeous photos, even modern, with like the deserts behind them. Oh, it's beautiful. And then like, see if there's ever a photo the literal opposite direction, because it's really, Cairo's like a bit of a dystopian sort of city built up right next to it. And it's just awful. Because it's the way it works. These things are no longer the transcendent, and they're now, how are they involved in capital? But bombs are a little different. Bombs do a lot. Let's talk about Israel and Palestine. Like the investment into Israel, the money spent on weapons, the destruction of Palestine. There's a lot of reasons for it in terms of interpersonal things and religion and blah, blah, blah. But like, why are we as an entire culture putting billions of dollars of bombs into a very specific place? We have a lot of reasons for it, but we can justify, we can think about, but at the base, we need somewhere to put the energy. We need the excess is being produced. And capital does this specifically through the destruction and then the rebuilding, as we do. Look at what we did to Iraq, the trillions of dollars spent in Iraq, leveling everything and then rebuilding everything, sort of worse, but more expensive and also less useful. But this setup is expenditure. This is finding new ways to expend that excess. And this is the big deal they're wanting us to think about. Is that fair, Jack?
Regarding Israel and Palestine?
No, regarding all of what I've just said, the way that, Jesus Christ. I mean, Israel and Palestine I'm not going to ask about because I'm pretty sure we agree. But what I'm talking about in general, about the way that anti-production is utilized, what the excess is done with, why the excess is there, blah, blah, blah. I had a long ramble. I know I said a lot, but I don't think I was that. Was I that incoherent? I mean, that happens, to be fair. But I think I was fairly coherent.
Yeah, I mean, so surplus value is this point about so it's like the second and third syntheses, right? Like it's this question about production creating. So it's about Newman and de voluptas, such that there's an excess that the social body can appropriate, right? And this is where you have the falling back on production. And this is where you start to have not just voluptas, but the eternal return starts to become a big deal. As far as capital goes, right, the move they're making here is to say that anti-production becomes a part of that process in a unique way, right? Because it's an imminent part of that process. So in that sense, right, anti-production is doing two things, right? It's making the surplus value of human labor and of machine labor possible, right? And it's making it realizable.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where like the decodification, right? That sense of schizophrenization that they're talking about is coming into play, right?
Yes, completely. Does anyone have questions or comments before we move to the next paragraph, which is kind of the brunt and the big deal? Or at least I think it is.
Just a basic question about when they say surplus value. Surplus means it's extra that can be, can derive profit from. Is that what it's supposed to mean?
Not
Well, it could, like I'll let Jack answer in a second. To me, its value can be used to then create further profit. That's fine. The problem becomes that there is a fuck ton of excess. Like, we're not talking about like there's an extra $10 in the system a year, which we could probably find a good use for. Like, but you're talking about like billions of dollars. You're talking about an extraordinary amount of, and I value it in dollars, which is I think part of what I'm talking about. There's a mass amount of excess value that's produced, and this excess value, this excess flux, because necessarily it is that, doesn't really belong to any single place or thing. It's kind of this grand, larger, constantly growing ball of shit that has to be expelled somewhere, and that we have to figure out a way to have the controlled expulsion of it, or at least this is how we understand it. I don't think I'm probably speaking too much from within the mindset than outside of it, but the need for us to find a good use for it, to absorb and to take all of this excess that is constantly produced more and more and more. When in the old days, when a worker would be made cheaper and redundant through the commodification of industrial labor, when we'd have a loom show up that was automated and we'd be able to have a worker do more and produce more. That's great. But at some point, we had the technical people also come along who designed that loom, and the increase in technical prowess, the increase in what engineers and scientists are capable of in the way that they shift the flux of scientific and technical code. And they do this in the core areas. There's a reason that technical spaces tend to overlap in spaces where capital is very, 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 very prevalent. This is growing, I would say, exponentially, and at the same time, we need a use for it, and it's got to go somewhere, and there's just a fuck ton of excess. And so what do we do with it? Well, the system and the way that the system is built, because of the state with the way it handles surplus value, which we're about to get into, necessitates that we expel it in a way that is sort of I don't want to say self-fulfilling prophecy or apocryphal, but it is something that then creates the need for itself as anti-production does. Go for it, Jack. Sorry.
No problem. So I'm going to answer your question by phrasing the question in terms of what is the difference between profit and surplus value, right? And that might seem a bit fuzzy at first because I think we often want to equate the two, especially if you're coming from like labor surplus theory, where it's, it's not necessarily conceived of this way, but it's often discussed in that way, right? Profit is a question of appropriating surplus value of labor. So in a sense, right, profit can be understood as a kind of excess or leftover between finances or between labor value input versus labor value output. And I think what starts to happen as you're doing that is you start realizing that profit's not, there's a way of conceiving of profit that is basically the essence of everything I've just described. And I don't know that it is in a sense, for me at least. I think in that sense, profit becomes something that relies on these kind of mechanisms, but is not itself like the essence of it all, right? And if you take that approach, right, the surplus value Deleuze and Guattari are talking about, I think starts to come into view a little bit cleanly, in the sense that even when they're talking about the falling rate of profit, right, it's not inherently a problem of profit itself, but a problem of production, such that it's not about the profit on the income statement, it's about the production of the surplus value, right? So what is the surplus value? Basically what you're dealing with is, again, it's kind of this point between the two, the last two syntheses between Newman and Voluptus, right? It's this question of the capacities and the capacities in terms of their flows, in terms of Newman, right, as becoming intensifications or intensities that are voluptus, right? And this becomes the kind of value, if you like, upon the territories that the celibate machine will effectuate, that will be consumed by the subject, that are kind of radiating there for the machines, right? That surplus value has a part that is appropriated by the social body or the BWO, right? And it's in that sense I think they mean it, because on one hand, you have that surplus value on the surface of that body, and on the other hand, you have the body falling back on production as though it's conditioning the production of that surplus value, right? So it becomes a question of Newman and Voluptus alongside this question of production generally, so that you're dealing with basically how surplus value plays a role in production itself, as I've described, and how it begins to play a role in reproduction, right? And going back to like the falling rate of profit and that becomes the thing that's getting managed there, right? Or the thing that's at stake, right? The displacement of the limit is a way of changing that production of surplus value. A few paragraphs ago, they were talking about GDP, right? How to kind of maximize GDP relative to a limit, right? It's the same problem. And GDP is not necessarily a profit, right?
Well, see now,
Domestic
now you're
product, right?
now you're straight up in the next paragraph, like straight up. That's the next paragraph, like literally talks about GDP and labor wages.
You can
So-
thank me later.
I know, but it's the underneath it. The thing they're really driving at, and they're really wanting us to spend time thinking about, is how the system as a whole, desire passes through, is utilized by, and then expended. And again, when we talk about the expending, this is, to Jack's point, we've got to think through how they're talking about the syntheses, because we're not talking about, some wacky new process. We're talking about the same stuff they've talked about before, the consumption, the way that these are used, how we have the excess, how these things are played. And so when we have surplus value, the next paragraph, which I'm going to dive into unless there's a major question on this one, the next paragraph really, really sort of drives into, to me, one of the core issues with all of this, when I spoke just now about how we're in a system that constantly is going to be slowly growing and growing and growing and necessarily has to. Why? Well, it's this next paragraph. So any questions, comments on this one before I dive forward? All right. To continue on, bottom of 237. The definition of surplus value must be modified in terms of the machinic surplus value of constant capital, which distinguishes itself from the human surplus value of variable capital and from the non-measurable nature of this aggregate of surplus value of flux. It cannot be defined by the difference between the value of labor capacity and the value created by labor capacity, but by the incommensurability between two flux that are nonetheless immanent to each other, by the disparity between the two aspects of money that express them, and by the absence of a limit exterior to their relationship. The one measuring the true economic force, the other measuring a purchasing power determined as income. The first is the immense deterritorialized flux that constitutes the full body of capital. An economist of the caliber of Bernard Schmidt finds strange lyrical words to characterize this flux of infinite debt. An instantaneous creative flux the banks create spontaneously as a debt owed to themselves, a creation ex nihilo that, instead of transferring a pre-existing currency as means of payment, hollows out at one extreme of the full body a negative money, a debt entered as liability of the bank, and projects at the other extreme a positive money, a credit granted the productive economy by the banks, a, quote, flux possessing a power of mutation that does not enter into income and is not assigned to purchases, a pure availability, non-possession, non-wealth. The other aspect of money represents the reflux, that is, the relationship that it assumes with goods as soon as it acquires a purchasing power, through its distribution to workers or production factors, through its allotment in the forms of incomes, a relationship that it loses as soon as the latter are converted into real goods, at which point everything recommences by means of a new production that will first come under the sway of the first aspect. The incommensurability of the two aspects, the flux and the reflux, shows that nominal wages fail to embrace the totality of the national income, since the wage earners allow a great quantity of revenues to escape. These revenues are tapped by the firms and in turn form an efflux by means of a conjunction, a flux, this time uninterrupted, of raw profit, constituting at one go an undivided quantity flowing over the full body, however diverse the uses for which it is allocated, interest, dividends, management salaries, purchases of production goods, etc. Just to go back a little bit, got to remember, capital and money are not the same thing. Susan de Brunoff and Marx both said this. Susan de Brunoff, through Marx, a wonderful book, Marx on Money, goes into this in depth. Kind of an important distinction here. Let's take this one bit by bit. I think it's worthwhile. The definition of surplus value has to be modified in terms of the machinic surplus value of constant capital. This is the money spent on the machines and things in the factory that make stuff that are not labor and are not external, like the constant capital, distinguishing itself from the human surplus value of variable capital and from the non-measurable aggregate nature of this surplus value of flux. We have to modify a bit. It's at this point, now we're talking about a lot more in the system. We're talking about this larger scale thing. So let's modify the discussion we had before and say that surplus value is a little bit different than just the surplus value from variable capital or machinic surplus. We've got to take a step because it cannot be defined by the difference between the value of labor capacity and the value created by labor capacity. Instead, it's defined by the incommensurability between two flux that are nonetheless immanent to each other, by the disparity between the two aspects of money that express them, by the absence of a limit exterior to their relationship. The one measuring true economic force, the other measuring purchasing power determined as income. This first one, as they say, the true economic force, is the immense deterritorialized flux that constitutes the full body of capital. When we say capital, when we talk of capital at large, we talk about capital as a thing, the full body. There's this immense full body of money that exists, not market, not cash, not money in my pocket, not the money I get paid, the immense full body of capital, the immense deterritorialized flux. Bernard Schmidt wrote kind of a lot of different stuff that sort of relates to, as I understand it, kind of touches into what we would today call modern monetary theory, but they've used the term infinite debt a few times. He's the dude who did that. He's the guy who kind of came up with that, and he does write, I would say, lyrically. It's probably a fair way to put it. So I'll read the paragraph and then I'll talk a little bit about burnout. An economist of the caliber of Schmidt finds lyrical words to characterize this flux of infinite debt, an instantaneous creative flow that the banks create spontaneously as a debt to themselves, and a availability of capital in the marketplace. When a bank loans a business money, or loans, let's say, WAG goes into the bank and is like, give me fucking $1 million. They're like, we love that. We love your idea. Here's $1 million. They don't just like transfer currency over. That's the simplistic way to look at it. Instead, what happens is WAG, given the million, sure, the million, but also, by the way, that million is made available sort of to the world. The capital marketplace kind of is ready for it. It's, oh, cool, there's $1 million. WAG has $1 million. Someone's going to be spending $1 million. Think of this happening everywhere. It's the availability of capital, liquidity of capital, availability of it. On the other hand, though, the banks put this debt on their balance sheet. And this is a little bit of an odd sort of thing that happens, because when we have the availability of capital put out and we also have this debt, it's not just sort of $1 million that's put out. There's this odd interplay where the amount of money WAG now has to pay back is more. You don't just pay back without principal. You have to pay principal and interest and other things in order to sort of allow these things to happen. So this odd process is a natural imbalance. There's almost, through the act of loaning itself, you create money, like just kind of out of nowhere, like, oh, it's $1 million we're going to make available. You're going to pay us back $1.1 million. We've made $100,000 extra on top of the balance sheet that we just sort of created. It's not just a simple transfer. As such, this sort of imbalance basically means that more money is owed than is ever actually in the economy. This is what the infinite debt sort of comes to be. If you think about it, if I loan you $100 and you have to pay me back 110, if there's only $100 in the economy, you're never able to pay me back, right? But we tend to think, oh, well, there's always more money. There's always, I'll be able to get that extra 10% and pay back that loan. I'm going to buy a car and I'm going to owe more on it than the car's worth the moment I drive it off the lot, but I'll be able to pay that back. There's more money owed than can possibly be made in the transaction, which is weird. And so in order to sort of have this system continue, in order for a loan to sort of not bankrupt the system, we have to basically constantly be creating new loans, making new cash available, perpetuating a cycle of debt. This is what Bernard Schmidt found sort of fascinating inside of the way capitalism works. Interest payments naturally are more money, require more money than was created through the loan. So we need to have constant growth in order to have the system function at all. That's the nature of debt, the nature of capital, the nature of the system as a thing. So we're going to get, it's a weird interaction. This is what they're driving at. When they use the term infinite debt, this is kind of what happens. We have this odd surplus created, this creation ex nihilo, instead of transferring a pre-existing currency as a means of payment. It hollows out at one extreme a debt entered as a liability to the banks and projects on the other a positive money, a credit granted. And that thing, it doesn't enter into income. It's until it becomes something. It's this pure $1 million available for things. If you ever have had money, I had a company I raised money for. I've had projects I've raised money for. The money that's sitting, once it's sent to me, I've already told people how it's going to be used. We're not talking about that setup. We're talking about the large scale financiers who just kind of get this availability. They're given this. And we see this problem sort of rear its ugly head a lot. A few years ago, 2020, 2021, there was this mass explosion in terms of the amount of money that was made available thanks to low interest rates and the way the banks were sort of working. So a lot of companies, Meta, for example, Microsoft, for example, Embracer is a huge video game company, as an example. They borrowed a fucking extraordinary amount of money from banks. The way it works is they would borrow tens of billions of dollars or billions of dollars, and they would put it against value of stock in the company, or they'd use the company stock as collateral or other things, and then they'd use that money to build new projects, to hire more people on, to do things, because they have to make payment on those, and they have to make that interest payment. Well, often what would happen over the course of this year or two, instead of paying back interest, they would actually take another loan to pay that back. This happened to an extraordinary number of companies. Embracer in the games industry is the one I'm most familiar with because I've been following it. But this happened at Meta, this happened at Twitter, this happened everywhere. When we're talking about this process then, this money made available, it becomes, at some point, it becomes a thing that has a relationship with goods, as they say, as soon as it requires purchasing power through its distribution to workers or production factors. Before that, it is a pure availability, non-possession, non-wealth. It is money in the economy. And this mass excess of owed, we have debt that goes with it. On the one hand, we have the debt entered as liability and the credit granted, the productive economy by the banks. When that shifts, when interest rates get up and it becomes prohibitive, when banks stop loaning, suddenly everyone has to pay all that money back. And so often they will, as they did, they will shutter the doors of parts of the company, lay off huge swaths of it, or file for bankruptcy in the case of Embracer, who went through a hell of a problem. These things that are happening, this is, again, part of that same process, because it is money made available, but the debt is there. The debt is growing. The debt is always there. The reflux and flux, as they call it here, the availability of cash, the turning of it, I don't want to say consumption, because we're going to get to that the conjunction in a second, but when it turns into income, the flux and reflux, it shows that nominal wages fail to embrace the totality of the national income, the GDP, as Jack was talking about, since wage earners allow a great quantity of revenues to escape. Because we do. A huge amount of money is made inside of America every year. We have, I think it's I want to say $5 trillion in tax income. It's like 4.5 to 4.8 trillion this year. That's how much taxable income there is, like money taxed by the government and redistributed. The wage earners, that's money primarily from wages. There's a lot of capital in there, but you're talking about really taxes on wages. The way that sort of works against the GDP is we actually had around 25 to 27 billion GDP last year. So there's an extraordinary amount of money out there, extraordinary amount of production, and a mass of available capital. But that's the thing. It becomes this other type. It becomes the capital of labor, and it doesn't quite embrace the totality of the national income. These revenues they're tapped in by firms, and in turn form an afflux by means of conjunction. A flux, this time uninterrupted, of raw profit, constituting at one go an undivided quantity flowing over the full body, however diverse the uses for which it is allocated, made available, and used. It's used as interest, dividends, management salaries, purchasing of production goods, the mass investment in real estate and ownership of that, whatever it is, this profit is then repurposed. So when we talk about the amount of money being actually kept in, the amount of value being produced, and that, again, the US GDP doesn't even come close to saying how much actual value is produced inside of the economy. We're talking about extraordinary sums that ultimately are tapped and handled uninterrupted at this point as this sort of available currency, as they're laying it out in terms of what Bernard Schmidt talked of. It's a large ramble, I know. But Jack, see, there you go. GDP showed up. I told you it was. But yeah, it's I'm open. You got anything, Jack? Anyone? No one? Anyone? Hello? Come on. Someone's got a chat.
Yeah, I guess I guess what I'd say is just it's a question of, again, Newman and voluptus here.
Expand on that.
Sure. Some loud thunder. So like, I mean, this question of labor power and machinic power, or like labor surplus and machinic surplus, right? Like, this is just ways of talking about the alliant and the filiative, right? So basically what they're doing here is, right, they're taking the three segments from the previous paragraph, right? What constitutes the immanence of capital social production, or social production under the conditions of a social body of capital, right? So you have the abstraction of human surplus value, the basis of the differential relation between decoded flows of labor and production that moves from the center to the periphery, while nevertheless maintaining vast residual zones at the center. So you've got this point about the alliant in terms of labor power and the flux of variable capital, right? As it pertains to a movement from the center to the periphery, like we talked about, right? And in doing so, it maintains residual zones at the center, residual being a key word. So that's one part of it. On the other hand, you have the filiative in terms of machine at surplus value on the basis of the axiomatic, right? And how that pertains to the core areas of the center, which would be like your more concentrated parts. So those are the two pieces of the disjunction, right?
Yes.
And they're walking out how that territorializes there. The one that absorbs or realizes these two forms of surplus value, or number three, the one that absorbs or realizes these two forms of surplus value of flux by guaranteeing the emission of both and by constantly injecting anti-production and the producing apparatus. So, right, the third part of the immanence being that anti-production is part of production and plays a very important role in how Newman functions and how voluptus functions, right? How those last two syntheses do what they're doing. Not that it doesn't affect the first, but they're underlining those two there. So in that sense, right, like this, the paragraph we're looking at now, it's just expanding this point so that it's focusing on how the two pieces of Newman function and what that means for voluptus.
Yes. Well, and it's also implying and talking about sort of the way that flux is ultimately the conjunction basically then ultimately comes back on itself almost, because it's kind of this odd interplay that they're talking about here, where we have this pure availability of money. The money then becomes invested in, say, the pizza parlor that I said we were opening last week. That pizza parlor then distributes money via machinic surplus labor by buying machines from firms that it needs, by paying wages, by buying food, which then gets redistributed. Like the potential, the sort of way that capital operates from this sort of space, this pure availability, non-possession, non-wealth, becomes wealth, possession, and not available. It's spent and used. And the workers at the end of the flow of that, because at the end of the flux, or during the flux of that, are constantly being exploited, so that way their excess is basically driving further profit that then becomes then used to pay back loan or get new loans that allow the system to sort of continue. So it's this back and forth where labor is paid out from this available capital space, and it's paid out in a lot of ways. It's not just purely through wages. It's machinic surplus, it's intellectual surplus. There's a lot of really great books on all the ways that capital is found to sort of do this, but it becomes actualized in those moments. It's almost becomes concrete. And this is the sort of flux. And then the reflux, as it is then spent, it's then commensurately used. These revenues are then formed from this mass amount of spending done by the population. And then the excess again is created, more excess. And then in turn, we end up having more availability as we pay back and then take out new loans that are enabling that. It's sort of this consistent cycle of spending and setup as they're talking about it here.
So would you be correct to say that that this very complicated economic system is a molar or social aggregate? It's it is a kind of synthetic process, right? Like Jack was saying, it's the Newman and voluptus, which is basically the conjunctive synthesis and the was it the
Look, I think to a point, because I think
disjunctive
disjunctive synthesis and conjunctive synthesis. Yeah.
Well,
So it is a part of the socius system of axiomatization.
Yeah. Well, yes. Sorry. Go ahead, Jack.
It's social production itself, right?
Yes.
So like capital is a social body, right? They're not talking about an economic system in terms of like traditional economic just basic systems, right? So you're just kind of, how do you describe capital? They're talking about how social production works with capital as a social body. And I make that distinguishment because remember, the other two social bodies are the earth and the despotic. So you got to be a little careful if you just go straight to economic systems, because what they're driving at, right, even when you see capitalism as an external limit rather than like a system in itself, is a question of production rather than basic economic system.
I would say that capital is the first economic system, at least system that is sort of economic in how it operates. A despotic doesn't, like, we can talk about the economy of the despotic systems, but it's not quite the same thing, because the power, the structure and the setup isn't within the economy. Instead, it's within the despot or within the earth under the other socius. Here, we're talking about a sort of hyper-distributed version of that, where within the interactions themselves, anti-production finds itself and is able to be produced and is utilizing itself. Within this system, we have an economy where where we have sort of a distribution of things rather than a concentration of it. And this distribution does odd stuff and it plays differently, but the economy, at least in the way that we traditionally speak of it, is it is an economic system. I would be very hard pressed to say that a despot has an economy, not in the way that we would probably use it today.
But when you say that there is a kind of a despotic element in that, it is power. I mean, this kind of
power
economic
becomes
system.
distributed too. Like
Right,
it becomes distributed. The state handles and makes sure that we have a uniform currency, which means that we have a single sort of value that things come back together. It's
right.
one of the things Susan de Brunoff talks about. We need the way that capital's set up is it ends up with. Sorry, you're echoing, JK.
Okay.
The way that it's sort of coming up is that if we had just a fuck ton of currencies, like I had a currency in my house, you had one, and then we had a Washington state currency and a West Coast currency and whatever, like we end up coalescing around a currency because necessarily the way that the system works is it has to find a way to extract a common value. And this sort of interplay, which they brought up, is again this sort of play back towards the way that the state finds itself within the economic system rather than as controlled by the despot. The despot's power becomes distributed and becomes placed within capital. Capital tells us through how it is laid out what we're able to do and allowed to do. I'm not allowed to go live in a big mansion house. I'm not allowed to do that. Why? Well, because I can't afford it. And capital's what determines what I'm allowed to do and not allowed to do. There's a power component that's intrinsic to it. How does that come to be? Well, it's through the very things that I think Jack was talking about, where we have this sort of odd ending place where this level of profit that's extracted that becomes this pure availability. Inside of that, again, as they say, that last step, we have the Y and X, we have the aligned and affiliative very close to each other, and then like up against each other, and then we have this excess produced. This excess is sort of determined by the state, but the state again determined by capital. So it's a mass social system that is in every point. It's why it's important when we talk about the earth and the despotic that we don't think we're talking about the despot, but all the people are just people like us, and the people are separate from that. No, we're all socially determined and socially invested and historically invested and historically determined. So we don't like, oh, I'm going to go escape capital isn't a thing that you like knowledgeably get to go do. You can keep chasing and finding stuff, capital's there. Why you're doing it is there. All of these things, the way that anti-production operates is there, because ultimately we get to the end, and this is the last little bit of this paragraph, is ultimately about driving this last bit, this surplus value, for its own sake. And this surplus value then ultimately gets spent, actualized from being pure availability. It gets spent out, it gets used in the industrial system, and then comes back in as further profit that then is reinvested in the next cycle. And it's continuous, and it's ongoing, and it is the system as a whole. So there is no part of the system that isn't the system. It's baked in. It's one of the challenges of capitalism, is there isn't a, oh, look, let's figure out a way to use money for non-capitalist. It's like, come on, that it's baked into everything. Is that fair, Jack?
Well, I mean, regarding economics, like, yeah, I mean, we want to, in 2024, right, we want to say economics is all about US dollars. It's economics is a lot more than that, to the point of what's being said, right? And it's, you go through the schools and you do go through the system. It changes quite a bit. I think for Deleuze and Guattari, right, they're not interested in doing just an economics in some sort of remove sense. I think what they would say, and I think they say it in this book, right, is this is about political economy, right, which is older than Marx, actually. Like, I think Smith and them were talking about that too. But it takes on a different meaning after Marx, of course. So I mean, that's this question of social production for them, right? It is libidinal, and it is political economy. But it's not, for me at least. I mean, look at how the veneer goes away when you're looking at what they're talking about here, right? It's not about profit in the sake of profit's self-service, right? It's about profit as something that is produced in part through the third synthesis, right? And how that plays into reproduction. It becomes less about the profit itself, as does it become less about the revenues. And it becomes more about how those are streams and lines and flows that are themselves social production, right? And I think that's kind of the thing the step back they're really taking from a lot of like Marxian work, is that, they're not saying profit is in itself the thing to attack. They're saying profit is a question of surplus value from the standpoint of the syntheses, not from the standpoint of, some basic worker exploitation.
Yeah, it's so deeply systemic. And again, this is why in my mind, this is why they bring up Bernard Schmidt, and what he talked about with infinite debt. Because when we talk about like the system as a whole, we're talking about, with this infinite debt, which is a term, again, they've used quite a bit, the constant outlay of capital that is non-actualized, that necessitates more capital to repay those loans. And this ongoing sort of thing is so extraordinary. You end up in a position like, if you didn't know, Taiwan, which is a center sort of place in the world for silicon chip manufacturing, especially with the new coming AI surge. You need so much water for making chips, like an extraordinary amount of water for producing chips. They actually have, in the last, I want to say 3 years now, because I know they're doing it again this year, they've paid out all of the rice farmers in Taiwan to not produce rice, which is kind of fucking wild, because they don't need it. They don't fucking need the rice. Who gives a shit? That's just not a thing that they need. That's the way it works. Instead, they need these AI chip. Why? Well, again, which will allow some level of these debts to be paid back so new debt can be visited, which allows what allows more money to be produced, what allows more profit at one go as an undivided quantity flowing over the full body, however diverse the uses for which it becomes allocated. This is how you end up in these positions. This is the economic system at large. But it's not just purely this sort of stratum that we're not touching. It's within us. It's within everything we're doing and all that we're setting up for. Even us having this conversation right now. We get to be schizophrenizing and doing things that are like we see non-productive over here. Capital's finding a way. What if I could make money off of this? What if we could make money off of doing this weekly? Should I? I think so. It'd be cool to do this weekly and make a couple bucks, because it'd be nice to have food. It's always waiting. It's always there. It's always waiting. I want to read the next paragraph, have a light discussion on it, and then we'll reread it next week.
We maybe review this paragraph a little bit more.
Sure, I'm up for it. Please.
Okay.
I think that was you, Jack. You were quiet.
Yeah, no, I'm thinking. Yeah. You can even smell it if you're around me. Now, which distinguish itself from the non-measurable. Okay. So so there's two. This paragraph actually addresses all three syntheses, even though it focuses on two of them. The definition of surplus value must be modified in terms of the machinic value of constant capital, which distinguishes itself from the human surplus value of variable capital, and from the non-measurable nature of this aggregate of surplus value of lots. So what's getting put together, right, is the alliant and affiliative, because what happens with those two productively, right, that Newman becomes the voluptus, right, the kind of co-charge of them, the covalence of them.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, insofar as you're dealing with aggregates, whether of machines or people, right, it's a question of how the aggregate is produced for the first synthesis, and in that sense, the connections and the machines involved, right? Which is important because that's the two dimensions of the alliant and the affiliative. It's going to be in relation to those groups. It cannot be defined by the difference between the value of surplus labor capacity and the value created by labor capacity. So notice what's being said there, right? The surplus is not a question of labor capacity and the value that capacity can create. So it's not what I would think is your standard Marxian point, right? How much social labor can you expend? What I would think is your standard and how much is expended. On the contrary, and that would be for people, since it says labor, but by the incommensurability between two flows that are nonetheless immanent to each other. So it's the difference between, again to that point of voluptus, the alliant and the affiliative, by the disparity between the two aspects of money that express them, which would be basically its value form D and finance and capital, and by the absence of a limit exterior to the relationship, the one measuring their true economic force, the other measuring a purchasing power determined as income. Yeah. So again, with the economy as a whole, well, in a sense, is kind of GDP. The other is a question of income.
Yes.
The first is the immensely territorialized flow that constitutes the full body of capital. Okay, so they're just working with the affiliative here. An economist of the caliber of Bernard Schmidt spontaneously is owing to themselves a creation ex nihilo. Okay, so this quote is just, at least this first bit, this is about how the affiliative functions, right? How financial capital functions. and by extension, how constant capital functions. So, right, like this is standard from the last two socii, the problem of creating debt from the finite to now the infinite. In this sense, right, the filiative is very critical for Deleuze and Guattari, and here's kind of the role it's playing, right, in terms of creating capacities.
Well, and it's the words a creation ex nihilo, a creation out of nothing. There's a reason they use filiative, and they have these terms sort of baked into these things. Like, this is the point: is it's a creation of capital from capital, out of nothing. Instead of transferring pre-existing currency as a means of payment, hollows out one end of the full body, a negative money, this debt entered as liability, and projects at the other extreme a positive money, an amount available in the larger scale economy, a new $1 million, $10 billion, whatever, available to be used, that is not possessed, it is not wealth, it is sort of just out there until it's actualized.
Yeah, so hold on a second. So the filiative is instantaneous, it's creative. It's a question of banks and their self-debt. So the filiative is here being linked to the financial institutions and how they perpetuate their own debt, right? So if you're thinking of a vertical, right, part of what's going on here is the banks have a line to themselves as well. They're
Right.
I don't want to say like self-fathering, but kind of, or self-mothering if you prefer. Yeah, and this is part of the filiative, right? So it's not repurposing something that already is there. It's creating something as simply a filiative movement, right? Because it's infinite.
Because, yes, it's infinite.
Sense.
It's being created ex nihilo. Yes.
Okay. Hollows out at one extreme of the full body a negative money. So the debt that's entered on the balance sheet. Okay, so the filiative has two parts. It has a negative side on the balance sheet and projects at the other extreme positive money, a credit granted to the productive economy by the banks. Okay, so so you have two lines here. You have the filiative in terms of this kind of self-fathering, and you have the filiative in terms of going out into the economy. A flow possessing power of mutation, so it's mutable, does not enter into income, and is not assigned to purchases, right? It's simply an availability, both as a liability and as a financing pool, I guess.
Sorry, which
Interesting, they
part?
call it non-possession, non-wealth.
Well, it's because it
Does not enter into economy and is not assigned.
Sorry, just real quick. It's worth, because I think the point is really important. Even though someone may have, like they get these investment firms have billions of dollars, but like it is in itself sort of a non-possession, non-wealth. The person has it. There's some level of possession, but it's not possession in the sense of like someone having $1 billion, like walking around it. Gabe Newell is the quote I always use for this. He's the guy who founded Steam, runs Valve, and he's worth billions of dollars. And someone asked him once, some kid in a college fucking class that he was lecturing asked him, how does it feel to have a couple $1 billion? And he said, well, I don't really have $1 billion. I'm more a filter or a sieve that billions of dollars pass through. And he started explaining, and I think it's a great explanation of it, where, it's not the same thing as like having money in your wallet that you're going to go spend. The money is like sort of sitting, and it's even though it's yours to determine what is done with in some capacity, there's lots of pushes and shoves and pressures in really odd ways. So the pre-availability, the non-possession, the non-wealth, I think is a really interesting way to sort of describe how this sort of capital at this level exists. Because again, the point they made earlier, really trying to get us to understand that capital and cash are not the same thing, I think continues here. Just my thought.
Okay. No, I appreciate that. And I mean, like, this is the thing about the two lines, right? It's a credit and a debit. So, I mean, what's different about this is for the primitive, it's just a debit, right? And it's a finite debit. For the despotic, it's a debit from the perspective of a credit, right? And that's what overcoding kind of is. To put it lightly, that's kind of what it does. Because it takes the finite debt to make it infinite as a credit. Here it's different, right? So on one hand, the affiliative has a negative use, which is this kind of self-fathering thing. And on the other hand, is a positive use, in which case it acts as a credit. So notice that the debit is this kind of self-fathering. The credit is this kind of movement into the general pool, I guess. But yeah, to your point, what's interesting about that, when the bank pushes money out, so to speak, it doesn't do it in terms of income, doesn't do it in terms of purchasability, it does it as availability. So this is like the pool of money they can lend at any instant that is always instantaneous, actually, since they say it's at instant, not pre-held, is itself a pure availability. It's not even something the banks possess, and it's not even the bank's wealth, which is a hell of a thing to say about a balance sheet. But yeah, what's interesting about the credit of the bank is that it is not the bank's. In fact, it's just available. Right, two dimensions of the affiliative there. The other aspect of money represents the reflux, that is, so okay, we're talking about the alliant now, the relationship that it assumes with goods. Yeah, so this is value form D. As soon as it acquires the purchasing power through its distribution to workers or production factors, so buying equipment perhaps, through its allotment in the form of incomes. A relationship that it loses as soon as the latter are converted into real goods, at which point everything recommences. Okay, so I think this is where C and M are coming in, right? Like there's this point about, so on one hand you have money and commodities, on the other hand you have money becoming commodities and commodity becoming monies. But that is itself a point about labor power, and more importantly, right, variable capital. Because income itself, in terms of its decodification or its deterritorialization, is the flux of variable capital, right? As again, with kind of like two dimensions to it, right? One in terms of money, one in terms of money's converted into real goods, at which point everything recommences, right? And so reproduction happens. The incommensurability of the two aspects, which they call flux and reflux. So now we have two new dimensions of the affiliative and the alliant there. Shows that nominal wages fail to embrace the totality of the national income. That made sense because they are not available, since the wage earner allows a greater quantity of revenues to escape.
I would argue, I would say it's not so much that it's not available, because nominal wages is money that is made available. Like it's basically money that's converted to goods or utilized by labor. So this is the stuff that is available. The two sides, flux and reflux, its nominal wages fail to embrace the totality of the national income. Just wages being GDP, which generally is how a lot of shit is sort of discussed, is kind of amazing as a thing.
Yeah, the part that sticks out to me is that for them it's a question of again escape. So I mean the difference they get at is that nominal wage earners fail to embrace the totality of the national income, since wage earners allow a great quantity of revenues to escape. And I guess like for the availability point, this seems to me to be that point about kind of like MC, but just in general, like incomes converted into real goods, as they say, right? So purchasing power realized, right? In that sense, the money's not held on. Less of the money is held on to, whereas the affiliative in terms of availability, seems to be kind of holding on to money, since on one hand, the bank is putting it in this kind of self-fathering way on the balance sheet, and in another way, creating availability. So you have like the realization happens in two different ways there. Yeah, there's a lot being. I mean, we could continue dwelling on it just for the sake of finishing the paragraph. These revenues are tapped by the firm. It's always the firm. These revenues are tapped by the firms and in turn form an afflux by means of a conjunction. Right? So we're talking about how the affiliative is coming in here. Revenues. Or maybe both, but we'll see. A flow this time uninterrupted of raw profit, constituting at one go, so-called, an undivided quantity. Yet they talk about dividends, an undivided quantity flowing over the full body. So we're talking about voluptas, we're talking about territorialization. However diverse the uses for which it is allocated, such as interest, dividends, management salaries, purchase of production goods, etc. So I mean, I guess my final point here would be, it's interesting to think, do these revenues, are they talking about, I think, the flux and the reflux here, but at the same time, what they're kind of getting at, right? Because in this sense, now they're talking more about how Newman is becoming voluptus here, I think, and more about how that surplus value plays into those two sides, right? One of which is appropriation, the other of which is this movement over, this territorialization. That's the word I'm looking for.
Yeah, I can see that. Because GDP is a fascinating sort of measurement. One of the things that it is ultimately is basically it's consumption, because it's goods and services produced effectively. And so a lot of that comes from sort of the allocation of available capital to business, which then spends it on goods directly, on machines directly, or on labor, and labor then spends it directly. So it's the production and consumption of those goods. It's really interesting as they're sort of taking it and talking through it, because ultimately, again, it ends with what I think is the core point. These revenues are tapped by the firms and in turn form an afflux. An afflux is different than a reflux and is different from a flux, by means of conjunction. And this flux, this is uninterrupted of raw profit, constituting at one go, constituting like here and now, is in once, an undivided quantity flowing over the full body. However diverse it may end up being used, this is the point of capital.
Yeah, and again, it's about putting those two pieces together, right? It's about how the affiliative and the aligned are working together there. Because even with GDP, right? I mean, the other piece of it is G, which is government, right? So I mean, that's where they were talking about like the government sector, the production of warfare, and so forth, right? I mean, that's one of the things that government can do, and it goes straight to GDP, right? It's a similar point where, like you mentioned, art and science, right? One of the things FDR did was pour money into that and infrastructure, right? At the same time, money poured into warfare. Both of those things contributed to GDP through the G portion, government expenditure, rather.
With that, I'm going to say we're going to call an end to it. Later this week, I'm going to be doing a sort of follow-up, sort of ask me anything about the section. We'll kind of go over it. I want to spend a little bit more time sort of going through a couple of these things. I'm sure a couple people could use it. But just before we go, I do want to make sure that we sort of state the beginning of the next, because one of the challenges of this book and of Deleuze and his writings on this, specifically in this book, In 1,000 Plateaus, is that people come away thinking capitalism's based, or that capitalism is schizo. And I just want to say the first line of the next paragraph, which will be fun next week. The incompetent observer has the impression that this whole economic schema, this whole story, is profoundly schizo. The incompetent observer would be sort of the key word there. So don't go down the wrong path of this. This is a critique. This is a discussion. This is us trying to break down how these things work, and that there is schizophrenia at the periphery, that there is schizo behaviors inside of it. You'll find it all over the place. This does not mean that the process or the overall system is as such. It's important, especially as we kind of get going. So with that, I want to say thank all of you for joining us. It's been lovely. And yes, I am taking shots at Reddit philosophy because it's horrifying. But thank you guys for joining. Always the highlight of my week. And I will see you all later this week. Be watching. We'll see you soon. Bye-bye.
Yay, thank you.